Welcome to Mapping Global China Conversations. I am Maria Adele Carrai and I'm an assistant professor in Global China Studies at NYU University Shanghai. The Mapping Global China initiative aims to catalyze meaningful discussions and deepen our understanding of China's global role through an inclusive platform providing comprehensive data and multimedia resources. Today, we have the honor of having Kevin Xu with us. He is the founder of Interconnected Capital, a global technology hedge fund, and also the author of Interconnected newsletter, a great source for you to subscribe. I want to start this conversation with Kevin, and if you can tell us about how did you end up where you are today, because you have a very interesting story to tell. From China to Stanford to now managing this hedge fund and leading this newsletter.
First of all, thank you so much again for having me. It's great to be with you in person here on the beautiful NYU New York campus. So my story actually is wrapped up in the word interconnected itself. So when I wanted to start this newsletter about 4 years ago, I wanted to basically explore the Venn diagram of technology, business, investing, and geopolitics, not one or the other. And the reason actually has to do with my personal background, like you said. So I was born in China, moved to Canada when I was 10 years old, to the US when I was 14, and then after college, went straight into US politics. I was on the first Obama presidential campaign and then worked in his government in the Commerce Department and the White House. So I got some DC experience during the first little phase of my life, and then transitioned out to the West Coast, went to law school at Stanford, but then just fell into the entire Silicon Valley scene. You cannot escape tech if you go to school in Stanford, right? And then I became, a reasonably high-level executive in a few technology startups. Most recently, I was working at a company called GitHub, which is one of the largest website or platform for developers and programmers to collaborate on open source code. I was leading their international expansion strategy team. So I was helping the company go to different markets around the world, including China, Brazil, Japan, what have you. And it was during that time that I also started writing this newsletter, because I have all these kind of different varying experiences, right, in different disciplines, and I want to tie them up together because there's so many interesting overlaps and interconnections, if you will, with all these disciplines. And that is really both the reason why I give my newsletter the name, but also kind of reflects a version of my personal story.
Wonderful. Thank you. You are an expert of AI. You became an expert of AI, connected to all these other different disciplines. And you're also an expert of China. So you're from China. You've been engaging in understanding and analyzing its market and its recent development, especially in AI. Can you give us an overview of the current state of AI in China? What are its major advancement, and how does it compare with other countries, leading countries, in particular the US?
So my expertise in AI really actually stemmed from my previous work in the technology sector, where I was almost exclusively involved in open source technology, open source enterprise software, cloud computing, networking, kind of the picks and shovels of all the internet devices that we use, right? And this was before ChatGPT. So when ChatGPT came along, right, there are a lot of kind of new AI experts that came out of the woodworks after ChatGPT, but I really leveraged all my cloud experience before to really understand this new platform shift, because a lot of AI that we use today, whether it's your favorite chatbot or your favorite image generation app, they're all stemming from cloud computing resources at the end of the day. And this is relevant to the question that you asked, which is, what is China's kind of AI development, right? And I'll separate that into two phases, the pre-ChatGPT phase and kind of the post-ChatGPT phase. So pre-ChatGPT, there's already been a lot of I would call them, I guess, traditional AI use cases when it comes to using algorithms to build self-driving cars, to automate supply chain and manufacturing, to have robotic arms to make more goods more efficiently in China. There has also been a lot of kind of like consumer level AI application too, right? Like if you think about TikTok and the super addictive algorithm that pushes out the short videos so you can never get out of the app, that is a application of artificial intelligence, of machine learning kind of on crack to be able to have a very sticky social network application. So that's been going on for quite some time in China, as well as in the US. So there's already been a little bit of a competitive dynamic, or at least like a race, right, between different technology companies on both sides of the Pacific. And then we fast forward to the post-ChatGPT phase, which is specifically about generative AI, right? Which is a very different kind of AI, where the AI itself is generating content, image, video, what have you. And that really kicked this competition into a new phase, where the underlying hardware, again, the server, the processors that go into the cloud computing data centers to power generative AI applications, has become so much more powerful, right? That I would say right now there's actually a bit of a gap between US and China when it comes to the generative AI development competition, because of one, the fact that US had a first mover advantage, right? ChatGPT kind of came out of nowhere, but it's been in the works in OpenAI for several years before it was launched. And that caught a lot of people by surprise, especially in China. And that's why in the last couple of years, there's been this bloom of AI model kind of industry, right? In China, it's called the 100 model war, where every technology company and their grandmother is making a AI model to try to catch up. To really kind of close this gap. But there's been a lot of difficulty in that development because the United States has been implementing export control on the most advanced semiconductors to be sold into China. And because right now generative AI is so dependent on the best hardware to be available, there's been a little bit of a gap between the development in generative AI between the US and China.
Thanks. Another aspect of developing AI is also government policies, right? And so I think on one hand there is the US that is constraining China AI rise. But can you tell us also a bit about Chinese government? What are the policies and maybe some of the constraints that is put in? Because I was reading how now you have to go through a lot of different regulations to have an LLM, and it's hard for these companies to respect this new rules and regulation. While I think in the US it's much more liberal, right? There's still censorship in some way, right? Because there is a politically correctness, and so there are some things that needs to be kind of respected, but in China it's a different story, it's a different world. So can you elaborate a bit on these differences in terms of policies?
That's right. I think in the United States, our government, for the most part, is still very hands-off when it comes to what goes on in the technology sector, though that's obviously changing. In China, I think one big picture thing for folks to understand is that the national government, right, in Beijing has a way of expressing their preferences for the kind of technology that they would like to see grow and bloom and prosper. And there's also a kind of technology that they kind of want to keep under wraps for a various of reasons, right? The ones that they like a lot are what I call hard tech. These are technology that you can touch, you can feel, it makes stuff. It makes stuff that people can use, and it's also easy to kind of see really what's going on. If you're like a Beijing leader, you go into a province or a city, you want to tour the latest development of the local government. These are all things that they want to see. So what that transpires into are factories, are EVs, are certainly semiconductors, right? And a lot of these things that you can feel and touch. And because of the export control, that's really only been in effect in the last 2-3 years, starting October 2022, there's now a huge emphasis on also self-reliance because the Chinese government has realized that so much of the critical technology that's going into the future, they don't have, and they don't know how to make proficiently right now. So there's a huge emphasis on that. And then we come to the category of technology that they're very kind of ambivalent about, and that is what I call soft tech. And soft tech includes things like gaming, things like social media, really. Things like even EdTech, for example, when we had the huge policy crackdown on education technology platform, right? That's really information. It's not something you can touch. Is, kind of like mothers in Ohio and Maine teaching Chinese kids English, right? And that has cultural ramifications. And when we fast forward to now, the LLMs that you're talking about, the generative AI chatbots, that, in my interpretation, has been mostly shoved into the soft tech category because it generates a lot of content that's, one, difficult to actually control, two, difficult to actually predict because by its nature, a large language model is a probabilistic approximation of knowledge, not deterministic. And that makes it very difficult to predict what it could really output at any given moment. And that is the reason why all the different models, the hundreds of models that I was talking about, must go through kind of at least a registration / a light pre-approval process with the government before they can release any application that is built on top of the model, which is a very different environment, right, than the Silicon Valley environment that I came from, that we're used to in the US, where you release something in the wild first and then you see what happens. And that makes kind of building generative AI applications in the consumer space, specifically in China, a lot more difficult.
And what are the ethical implications of these different approaches, right? Because there is all an ethical part, because it constructs our languages, culture, information. It has huge implications that we use. So do you think that there is this consideration? Do China and the US share similar ethical and regulatory kind of challenges? And what's their approach?
Right. I think the concerns are quite similar, but there's probably not enough actually dialogue between the two governments these days to share best practices, if you will, even though both sides are kind of struggling with different variations of the same problem, like deepfake, right? Like there was a lot of deepfake prior to ChatGPT, and China was actually one of the first governments to actually release some policy that's related to governing deepfake or like synthetic content. And now with generative AI, it just become a much bigger problem, right? And there are a ton of ethical concerns that you can imagine that both sides have to deal with, even though their governing structure and preference are very, very different, right? The system of government is very, very different. I would say another kind of more concrete example that I'm seeing more lately is that generative AI has also kind of pushed more attention back into robotics, and possibly with new advancement in self-driving specifically. Recently, we're seeing a lot of Baidu's self-driving robotaxi product being more widely kind of promoted and used in Wuhan as one of the first test cities, and more permissions and certificates are being given by the Shanghai government and the Beijing government to make robotaxi more of a widespread service. And that has caused a lot of anxiety among all the ride-sharing drivers in China who was afraid of losing their job. And that's a identical concern you can imagine that we in the US or in Italy or in the UK or in Brazil or anywhere in the world that has a ride-sharing service, which is most cities around the world these days, would have that kind of ethical societal fear when robotaxi becomes a more mature application of artificial intelligence. And that's something that I'm watching very closely, because there are a lot of things that's happening in China that could be leading indicators, or even like an advanced warning sign, if you will, right? Because they're moving fast in a lot of different sectors that we're not here in the United States. And how the government deals with the ramifications is something that we ought to learn about.
Thank you. And decoupling. So we talk a lot about decoupling, and there is this sense of threat from China that has become a 360-degree kind of perceived threat, almost an existential threat. Where is AI in that, also in terms of national security, economic security? And do you think it's possible, a decoupling? What are the implications for US and China, but also for the world? Because this technology will expand, ideally, right? It will become a model used in the global south, the developing world. What is your take on that?
I think in the context of decoupling, right now, the US and China, and I would say the US plus its Western allies when it comes to Western Europe and Japan, has already decoupled quite cleanly with China when it comes to the supply chain aspect that leads to the manufacturing of the important processors, the GPUs that goes into the data centers to be able to actually train and build these models, right? If you look at the manufacturing side of things, these chip fabs that we're talking about, China has already been kind of cut out from all the options that it used to be able to access to build chips in Taiwan, to build the chips elsewhere. And the US is obviously reshoring a lot of that capability in Arizona, et cetera. And then if you look at the key equipments that go into manufacturing these advanced chips, like the EUV equipment, the electronic design equipment, those are all US companies. And those are all, Japanese companies that they're being slowly but surely cut off from the China market, which again pushes the government to really dig deeper into this self-reliance theme, because it really doesn't have a whole lot of other option other than to completely indigenize its own ability to build a advanced fab, which is trying to build its own equipment to etch the most advanced chips, because it has no other option. So in a sense, that is what I think of decoupling. What it looks like in real life is that you have all these options you could purchase from in a natural kind of globalized world that is not where we live in anymore. So you have to just build your own thing to recreate the wheel constantly, because that is the reality that you face. So in that particular use case, which directly impacts AI, decoupling is more or less already kind of baked in for a little while. And if we expand the kind of horizon to other industries, I would say there are other kind of non-technical or non-advanced technology sectors that decoupling is not really that important. And what you really see is in lengthening of supply chain, not a decoupling of supply chain, is Chinese furniture manufacturers, right, setting up shops in Vietnam and Mexico to be sold into the US. So you just make the supply chain longer, a little bit more harder to manage, but the source is still the same and the end customer is still the same.
But for the chip, that's not the case. It's not a kind of extended supply chain. It's just kind of cut off.
That's
China.
Right. Yeah.
And do you think China can catch up? Do you think like in 10 years' time, it will be able to indigenize the production of this chip, or even surpass the US potentially? What do you think will be the possible future scenario?
It's hard to predict, but I would say that China's ability to engineer and build things is incredibly powerful. We see that in all the things that we use, quite frankly, in our daily lives here in the US, right? So that is kind of a given. That being said, I think recreating the level of advanced technology to build semiconductors, for example, is going to take quite some time. Will China be able to catch up? It's hard to know. Will they be able to kind of replicate the things that we have access to, but just with like a 2 to 4 year kind of lag in a consistent basis going forward? That is, to me, the most likely scenario, where you kind of have a parallel line going, right? Where the West/US is kind of still at the top and trying to catch up, and this line kind of sometimes closes it, sometimes widens it, but it'll always be a little bit of a parallel. When it comes to the line crossing, it's kind of hard to see at the moment, but we will see what happens.
So we have here in the States a very interesting election, campaign, etc. Very, very surprising. What do you think will change in terms of China policy if Harris, most likely, or Trump will get elected? What do you think will change in terms of this competition, supply chain? Will they soften the tone, or will still be very harsh and promote decoupling from China?
My base case right now is that more will stay the same than be materially different, right? I think there's one thing that Washington, D.C. agrees on, and one thing only, and that is China is our biggest competitor. China is our biggest adversary in a lot of ways, and we need to really marshal all of our policy resources to contain or counter China everywhere it goes. And whether it's Donald Trump or Kamala Harris becoming the next US president or somebody else, we don't know. It's still a very volatile election season, unprecedented, right? In a lot of ways. I think there's going to be a lot of consistency there, which means on a practical level, all the tariffs that we have on China will probably stay the same. There'll probably be a few more tariffs that's going to be in play, especially if Donald Trump becomes president again. I think export control on the technologies that I was talking about will continue to be just as stringent, if not maybe a little bit more, depending on how the AI landscape evolves, which really is kind of the big topic that's taking over the competition discussion between these two superpowers.
Thank you. And in terms of China AI strategy, or from a geopolitical point of view, do you think China has a strategy how it might influence the developing world? Because this is a kind of a new territory potentially, right? Because you have the main countries that are developing this technology, this LLM and so forth, or even social media. Think about TikTok. Do you think there is a strategy behind China geopolitical strategy in terms of AI development, and what are the implications for the developing world?
I think as far as artificial intelligence, broadly speaking, it's been in the policy-making key documents in China for several cycles now, right? At least probably let's just trace it back to a decade or so. So it's always been a topic that's on top of I guess the government leader's mind. As far as the strategy is concerned, I go back to my hard tech argument, which is that if this generative AI thing is going to help accelerate all the hard technology products and advancement that the government wants to see, whether it's robotics, advanced manufacturing, supply chain management, aviation, then by all means deploy it. But if it gets into areas that is more dicey, we are going to put, we being, I guess hypothetically the Chinese government, will put a wrap around it, right? And when it comes to the global south, that really kind of comes to a lot of the cloud computing sort of footprint that large Chinese companies have already been building, because ultimately that's how AI gets delivered to the consumer's hand, is via cloud computing servers and resources. And if you look at the data center maps of Huawei Cloud or Alibaba Cloud or Tencent Cloud, they're building aggressively in the Middle East. They're building aggressively in Southeast Asia. They're building more and more into Latin America as well. I think Alibaba's recent announcement is opening up a new cloud region in Mexico, which is its first foray into that region. And Huawei Cloud, interestingly, built its very first cloud region in Egypt, and rolled out its own Arabic language LLM using its own AI technology to cater to that audience, which is, I believe, the first on the market right now, a Arabic specific LLM. So if you look at these clues, right, you kind of see where things are going when it comes to deploying AI from the Chinese technology company perspective. And part of that is strategic, right? I think the government may want to build more influence and goodwill or penetration to the global south. Part of that is also pragmatic, because all these companies would probably like to do business in the US, but they're shut out of the market. So where else could they go?
Thank you. Great point. What trend do you foresee in the next decades regarding AI development and its impact on US-China relations? And are there emerging technology or areas of research that you think will be particularly influential?
I think there are two areas I would cite. One is in the world of humanoid robots. So these are, actual robots that look like a human. In the most recent World AI Conference that was held in Shanghai, I think there were 25 different brands of humanoid robots that were on display in the expo hall over there. And
which is a big number.
Which is a big number. Yeah, which is quite a big number, right? Like in the US, I can count in the number of one hand how many companies are really investing in humanoid robots. One is Tesla, right? It's like Optimus, a robot, and the other one is a company called Figure AI that's doing really well in Silicon Valley, but it's a relatively new startup. And I actually don't know how to flip the third finger because I can't recall a third company, right? And a lot of that humanoid robot advancement in China is, again, one, practical, because China, as everybody knows, has a demographic problem. It's staring into a demographic abyss right now. And it's hard to reverse that momentum, if you will. And if you're the government policymaker kind of staring into this demographic abyss, one of the solutions you could think of is we just need more robots to really supplement the lack of humans that we're going to have in this country. So a lot of investment has been going into that sector, and generative AI may help accelerate that. And if that becomes a real at-scale product that China is producing, there could be a lot of, you can imagine, fear from the West, but also maybe a lot of people who want to also have those products because the
similar problems in
Exactly.
Italy. I mean, Elon Musk was kind of pointing the finger to Italy, right? That we also have a very
Exactly, because the demographic problem is actually quite universal. I think anywhere outside of West-Saharan Africa, the world has a demographic problem, right? Yeah. So that's number one. And the second one that's a slightly more speculative, but I think could come into play in the competitive realm, is using AI to do more pharmaceutical research, to do more biotechnology research, to create new drugs, new proteins, to help with heart diseases, but it also gets into data residency. I think, having people's data to do these sort of research is a very sensitive topic, right? The US Congress has already put out a Biosecure Act, particularly going at this problem of kind of preventing Chinese companies from accessing, genomic data, right? That is of Americans and other countries. So these are sort of the big battleground there, but AI does have some real potential use case in advancing our ability to better understand our body, right? To better cure certain diseases. So these are all supposed to be good things for humanity, but we'll see if that gets wrapped up into the competitive discussion or not.
Thank you. So last question, based on the insight you share in your wonderful newsletter, Interconnected, what do you think are the most under-discussed but crucial aspect of AI's impact on global geopolitics?
I think the one topic that I hope people talk more about is this impending cloud war that I'm seeing. I think we're all fairly familiar with the chip war between different countries, semiconductor versus semiconductor. This country has 4 nanometer, this country has 2 nanometer, which is about the tiny little thing, right, that we're talking about. But more and more, when you think about the application of AI, the way the hardware is being designed to produce and build better, more powerful AI models is large systems of 72 different chips, all connected together with high bandwidth memory, with different cables and interconnects, so they can work as a system. And these are, large server racks as tall as this room that we're sitting in right now. And all that gets installed in the tens, in the hundreds of thousands into large data centers around the world. And that is where I see the geopolitical fault line could start developing, not the small chip, but the cloud data centers, where they situate themselves, where do they serve, and also the kind of data that you also store on these data centers, which goes into data governance, data residency problem. But the cloud war is what I think we are moving into in the global technology competition conversation.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And so now we know that we are in a cloud war. We're entering a cloud war. Thank you. And please join, you should subscribe to Interconnected and join his great mailing list. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.